everyone, welcome back to the marker challenge. So your leaves are looking fab, and hopefully you've enjoyed all those tips from each other as well. But today we've been working on the buds. So here I have the same bud I used on my vellum because I really like this one. I'm going to use the big flower and leaves on my final project, but I really want to show this one. And I'm going to use the same piece of cardstock because you want to save one piece of the white kind of card front size cardstock for your final project. And again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to dry it thoroughly. And I'm noticing how this is now going matte. I can see it's absorbed into the cardstock. So it doesn't happen instantly to dry this in. It does take maybe like 30 to 45 seconds, which is why I say if you're going to do it, you want to leave it overnight, and you know, all those other hacks that I gave you as well. So that's nicely in there as well. So now you can see this is my bud I'm going to work with. I'm working with my corals, and potentially I might work with my feather grey as well, and maybe my blender if I make a boo-boo. Okay, so this is how we're going to do it. Again, I'm going to line these up in front of me in the right order. I just find that that helps. And then I like to work on my central pieces first, just like this. So the first thing I'm doing is laying down my colour. And of course I don't have to be too accurate because I'm going to colour the pieces above too. I just like to do a section because that ink stays wet enough for me to do that section there. And what you'll notice is as you practice, you'll start to know when you've laid down enough colour. So I can start to see when this has got a nice even coating and that colour looks nice and even. And you can see now on the back it's looking pretty good. So now we're going to go for our mid shade again. And I'm going to start in here, the same as we did on our vellum. And I'm just kind of flicking from the center out. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to add a little crinkle on the outside of my leaves. Now the way I do this in particular is just with like a little sketchy line. And the tip is to do a half moon, because if you have a circle and you colour it in, I'm trying to get my pens out here. Of course that looks really flat. Let me move it out for you. Whereas the second I put that half moon shape in, it really actually starts to take shape as a ball. Of course I would blend, and then I would take my darkest shade and I would add less of a semicircle, back to my mid, back to my light. And you see now how that's starting to look like a 3D object because we've added that half moon in. So think about your half moons when you're doing this. I always like to turn as I'm colouring as well. So there's my half moon in there. My half moon coming down here. And then my half moon in there. And now we're going to blend out with our lightest. So that would be this one. And at the minute I'm just kind of sketching in. But the thing with flowers is I find you can get away with a lot more kind of sketchy marks. And I have to excuse my sniffles. I have this cold from Tilly. And then I'm going to take my darkest shade. And then I'm going to be quite selective. So I'm going to add depth in here, but not too much. You'll want to think about if any petals are turned over. Now sometimes in a picture like this, you can see I've kind of done everything the same. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to lighten some areas. And then we'll go back to our lightest. You see how I'm flicking over the top just to soften those. So it just softens those marks in. And you can always go back and add more too. You don't necessarily have to, say that's it and I'm done. For instance, the pieces that I want lighter, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do those at the end. So now I'm going to work on the rest of my flower. Now I know that this, for instance, here is the turned over part of the petal. So I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind as I'm colouring. And I'm going to try to keep that lighter. And I made a little boo-boo there, but I can fix that with my blender pen, of course. Although I'm going to petition to rename it the bleaching pen. So again, just colouring in, making sure I've got a nice base colour. And you could do this with your chisel tip. I just find I don't get as much control doing it with my chisel tip, which is why I like to have it done this way. So I'm just going around and filling everything in. And this is probably the most time consuming part of the colouring, is just getting your base colour down. See how we're doing on the back. Looking pretty good on the back. As I say, you'll kind of learn when your colour starts to look nice and smooth, and anywhere that looks a little bit patchy. Okay, now we're going to go to that mid shade, and again I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to take, and I'm adding those half moons. At the same time also adding shadow, because for instance if you have one petal on top of the other, it's going to be darker in that area because that's going to cast a shadow. So I know that here I want to do little flicks because this is going to be a darker area. So I'm basically outlining that previous petal with my mid shade, but rather than outlining with a line, I'm outlining with little flicks. And then the other thing I'm going to do on this petal is it's got a really nice area for a half moon. So I can add lots of texture in there. And you'll notice I'm turning the whole time. Again, flicks. Not all the same length either. Make sure you vary up those lengths. This one also has a really nice area for that half moon to give us that roundness in the petal. Now sometimes when you look at stamps, you'll see there's a lot of cross-hatching or there's darker areas. That's a really good clue of where you should be putting your different shades into. So this one has a nice area in too. So I'm kind of half mooning all these petals indirectly. You can see how that already has that kind of bulbous flowery shape to it, I guess, is how I describe it. Then we're going to want to take our lightest shade. We're going to flick into those flicks. So we're going to soften them out. Again, I'm trying to avoid some of those back areas. But you also want some of that veining in there, so it's no bad thing to keep some of that veining in. Okay, so you can see that in there. And then we're going to go to our darkest shade. And this is where you want to be a little bit careful because you don't want too much of this dark shade. But for instance, like here, you know it's going to be like that. And you also want to add some detail into your object. You also know that here you've got that lovely half moon that you're trying to add texture into. And then what I might do is I might work leaf by leaf or petal by petal rather, and then I might, so that side's going to be darker with my half moon, or I might do larger areas, but you can kind of decide what works for your technique. So I'm going to work there, and I'm going into this one. This, and then I know there's going to be a lot of shadows in this area because those leaves are all overlapping. But if you take your lightest colour, you can also dull some of that down as well. But you see how this is kind of coming together as a really beautiful flower and bud now. You can see in here where I've done these two. Then we want to go to this one in here. So this in here, this V is going to be really dark. Like so. And then the next one. Really keeping this area here quite dark. And then going into our lighter. So you'll see as I move through different shades, I might change the texture and the colour in a particular leaf or flower. But I'm really loving, how these textures are coming out. If you feel that that looks too, I have to say the camera and how it looks in person are very different. But this kind of now starts to bring out some of those shades. And just kind of going backwards and forwards. So again, same thing, keep your half moon, add texture to your half moon, go into your light, just like that. Doesn't that look cool? So all of a sudden my flower is going from very flat on this side to really nice and rounded and fluffy and all those things we want on the opposite side. Again in here. And the other thing I want to share with you is one other tip I've seen somebody else give. I'm still definitely practicing on it, but you can add it into your practice repertoire. And it does work. It really depends on the flower that you're doing. Again, I'm keeping that half moon in there. And this side of my flower is going to be darker because I've got all that shadows coming in, whereas I think this side is going to be lighter. That's where I am in my mind because of all these petals hanging over each other. You're going to see all of those depths and shadows. So I'm going to have a lot lighter hand with my darkest colour on this side of my flower. So I might, got my half moon. And I'm going to do this one in here. This one in here. In here, and in here. And then we're going to take this. It's a little bit smaller, harder on the smaller ones, but it just kind of adds some finesse in and then blend out. And of course you can use your blender if you go over the edges like I just did. And push that colour back in. And you can see how I've left these crinkled edges lighter, and they've now got that really nice texture to them. You don't need to do much. You might want to take a little bit of either layering of your original shade, because you can layer colours up to make them a little bit darker. And you could add some in just on the larger areas. But I like keeping those a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter. So that's in there for you. And then just kind of looking it over. Want to soften out more over here. Add some fluff in here. So I was watching a tutorial a while back, and someone's tip was to add a Y on the top of your petals, and it does work. So what you kind of do is you take, I like to take the mid shade, and you add this Y. And you kind of always have a natural Y. You just have to pen in the rest. But you see how that kind of adds a little bit of extra texture in there as well. And then I would go in and soften these out in a second. But if you add Ys anywhere you think you'd have a crinkle, so like there, and there, here. You could practice with a coloured pencil too. But I have found that it really kind of enhances those areas where you really want to have that crinkle. And then I would take my lighter, blend in to my Y. Take a little bit of work to blend them. But just adding that extra little bit of shadow can add those crinkles in. So if I turn this way up, you can kind of see where I put those Ys. And the more I work on them, the more I can blend them out. You could also add them with a coloured pencil afterwards. But you can see how it really does kind of pull your eye into that petal and pull it down. So there's another kind of tip you can practice in there. I have found it's improved my petals and give them that extra finesse by adding that in there too. But doesn't that look awesome? So a little bit of a longer tutorial in today's tip. I wanted to show you colouring the whole bud rather than just part of it, so that you could go and practice that yourself. So I will see you again tomorrow. We're going to be doing grounding of images tomorrow, and then we're going to move on to our final project. So can't wait to see you then. Bye.